aggressors, but we and our allies have and will maintain a massive capability to strike back.
President, have you ever had any reason to doubt this so-called domino theory?
I believe it. I think that the struggle is close enough. China is so large, looms so high on just beyond the frontiers. The South Vietnam went, it would not only give them an improved geographic position for a guerrilla assault on Malaya, but would also give the impression that the way of the future in Southeast Asia is China and the communists.
I don't think that the true Australian wants safety on the cheap, nor does he want to leave everything to other people. It's abundantly clear that Australia must be prepared to do its share. And I'm perfectly certain that that will be agreeable to Australian opinion.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
When conscription was introduced, I took it as being just another part of my life, and we'd move on into another adventure. I was looking forward to it.
Well, I don't think I liked the idea of it anyway, taking the young fellas away when they had so many regular soldiers.
I was a volunteer, and I was glad that I volunteered to serve the colours.
I had to register for the very first ballot at the beginning of '65, and I was quite shocked. At that stage, I wasn't necessarily opposed to conscription itself, but the first thing I asked myself was, what am I being conscripted for?
I felt quite threatened that a busload of women would arrive at the gates of Puckapunyal with their banners, "Save our sons."
We used to hand out leaflets saying you have a right to be a conscientious objector. And just as the young men were going through the gates, one turned round to me and said, "I don't want to go, I've changed my mind, will you help me?"
The troops that went there volunteered to go. I mean, I don't care what anyone says, they were given a chance to pull out and nothing would have been said.
Well, he did like the idea of it. He did like the idea of going away, but he said that he wasn't a coward. He said his number come out, so he'd go.
I went to fight the communist aggressor from the north, as Bob Menzies kept on telling us all the time. Well, got to stop them coming down there and running into Australia.
Then early in 1965, we were told that we were going to join the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, and we drove from Holsworthy to Richmond Air Base. I don't think there was a lot of apprehension because we were volunteers for the regular army, and this is what we trained to do, so we wanted to get into the planes and get up to Vietnam and see if we were any good.
We had trained and trained hard and trained well and more importantly trained together, and I believe we were as well trained as we could be.
Dominant memory, dominant recollection is boys' own camp type thing, off to a great adventure. I think the journos that were on board the ship, and there were only 4 of us, felt it as strongly probably as the troops did.
We were excited, maybe apprehensive. We were certainly excited because this is the job we'd been trained to do, and we wanted to go and do the real thing.
The Vietnam situation was a very great leap into a much bigger war than we'd faced in Malaya.
The Army were very good. They told us things about the country, the customs, the religions, the politics.
I got the impression the authority was not the slightest bit interested in the history of the country that they were going to.
Nobody was worried because at that age, 19, 20, 22, nothing's going to happen to you personally. It's always going to be someone else. So our expectations were that, yes, we would be meeting the Viet Cong sooner rather than later. Any time that we got out of the aircraft, in fact, we were quite looking forward to it.
Next thing, we were whizzing along the highway and they seemed to have absolutely no concern for human life or property. in the way they drove this bus with the mesh up at the windows, and somebody sort of asked the question, what are we fenced in for? And then they indicated that that was to keep the hand grenades out. We shut up then.
When we arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base, we were astounded to see that we were being put into an enormous grassy paddock. And there were no trees or anything for the highly trained Australian jungle scientists to tie their little tents to.
Earlier this week, HMAS Sydney, with its load of troops and equipment, slipped quietly out of harbour on the first stage of its long voyage to South Vietnam. And with its departure, the commitment of Australia to the war going on there began in earnest.
There were interminable classes. My recollection is most of them were health classes. It was, identification of the enemy and health classes. For God's sake, stay away from the women up there, because there's strains of VD and gonorrhea you would not believe, and you'll never come home and you'll be stuck in a hospital for the rest of your life.
It was actually a little bit frightening because we'd had the briefing from the intelligence people. I think Major Peter Young, if I recall, came up to tell us about these Viet Cong. And we were actually convinced that these fellows were 10 feet tall and that they could probably cut your throat with their toenails.
When I arrived ashore at Vung Tau, I was pretty sure I was in a war, and I could feel the war was all around me.
Well, one RAI went to Vietnam to be attached to an American brigade. We were attached then to 173rd at Bien Hoa, whose task was to defend the Bien Hoa Air Base against Viet Cong attack. So initially that was our task.
We haven't got a problem really, just we've got to get used to the American idea. We seem to do things different than they do. It's interesting working with them. We've never worked with them before.
We thought they were a very good and elite group of soldiers. After we arrived, we found that, in fact, they knew next to nothing about jungle warfare as we understood it.
The big cultural difference, I think, was, one, we believed in patience, planning and stealth, whereas I think the Americans wanted to get the war over very quickly, and so theirs was mainly bravado and aggression.
When they come back here to camp, it's a bad time. We call it home at times. It's good to get back here for a bit of a rest, although they still have pickets to do and so on. We get our issue of beer, which is perhaps the best recreation for most of us in this hot, dry, dusty weather.
In early '66, the Americans realized that the headquarters of the Viet Cong and their both the logistic operations headquarters were in the Ho Bo Woods somewhere. It had been a place that the Viet Minh had used in French times, and that it was laced with tunnels, and this is all they knew.
And the idea was the Australians would land along the line of the villages and block, while the American battalions landed on the other side and, preceded by a B-52 strike, would sweep through the rubber plantations, capture this headquarters and score a glorious victory.
We went into the Ho Bo Woods on the 8th of January. Basically from the moment we got off the helicopters, we started getting contacts.
We did run into one foolish fellow who wanted to engage us with his small arms fire, and he suddenly found that there was 22 soldiers advancing towards him with 2 or 3 helicopters sitting off 50 yards to the rear of us, and after thinking about it for a little while, he decided to throw the weapon away and disappear.
They turned the corner about 30 feet from me, and I think I looked away or something at that particular time. And then when I turned around, I realised that the first guy in this patrol that was coming back was a Viet Cong.
And we didn't know at the time, but This washout had a tunnel running along the side of it and a series of firing slits, and the enemy proceeded to fire at my soldiers very close range. And Corporal Smith got hit, Private Delaney got hit.
And by the time I raised the machine gun up to fire, it was about 1.5 feet from the front of the machine gun. I pulled the trigger. He had another 6 or 7 guys behind him. And when I fired the rounds, I was watching through the sights, and they were just pouring into his head, and his head was just exploding. But the fire from the machine gun was actually holding this guy up. It wasn't allowing him to fall onto the ground.
We continued to push forward, and I think around about that time, I went out to help Delaney, and as I was pulling him back into some shelter, I got hit from about very close range, a couple of inches. I ended up with powder burns on my lip, and I dropped Delaney in front of the slit.
It wasn't until after then that the shock started to hit me as I started wiping bits of his brains and so forth like that off the end of my machine gun. That's why Hobo Woods, I don't remember much of what happened through the rest of the time of Hobo Woods, because my mind was taken up with what had occurred at that particular time.
I thought I might as well try and do my job while I was there. In fact, I was terrified, to be quite honest. I recall almost having the feeling that I wanted to run, but I suppose because someone had educated me sufficiently, I didn't run. I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to make it at that stage, but they threw me on a chopper. I was sitting on a dicky seat on the side, and there was this big black American sergeant. There was his machine gun there as a door gunner. And he's obviously the crew chief, because he said to me, he said, "Hey, Guy, would you like a copy of the Stars and Stripes?" Well, here I am, you know, my both eyes are closed and there's blood pouring out my mouth. And I said to him, I said, "Hey, I can't read." And he said, "I don't want you to read it. I want you to put it on the floor because your blood's messing my helicopter up." Mongrel. Anyway.
I regret that when we actually searched this guy, that he was only 18 years old. And to put that into context, I was only just 19 as well, you know.
There was only 20, out of the 22 blokes in my platoon that went out in that operation after it was wound up 3 or 4 days later. There was only 11 of them that walked back, and the rest had holes in them.
One of the most frightening things that hit us as soon as we hit the Hobo Woods, particularly at the LZ, we ran into these extensive tunnel systems that we were not expecting.
The tunnels were absolutely massive. It grew day by day by day.
After 2 days, the fellows who were clearing them were absolutely worn out. So the boss then decided, was all hands to the pump, and suddenly the smiling radio operators were down the holes as well, and we weren't then smiling, I can tell you.
Yeah, well, the earliest techniques of going down tunnels was, first of all, going down head first, with a bayonet in one hand and a torch in the other. And, of course, this meant that we had no protection.
Once you did enter the tunnel, it was elongated. It was like getting into a coffin.
We didn't really understand the importance of tunnels and how big this was and all this sort of stuff, you know, until we pulled out so much intelligence, you know, like 100,000 sheets of paper we pulled out of this, besides all the tons and tons of explosives.
So you'd come along down the first tunnel and you'd find a trapdoor. Once you cleared that, you go down to the next tier, which was straight down. Then you'd crawl along and you'd find another trapdoor.
It wasn't until all the information was disseminated and looked at by the intelligence organisations that they said, "Hey, this is really valuable stuff."
Turned right, and in the torchlight all I saw was 2 eyes looking at me. And I shot back round the corner and I thought, what's that? So I put a pistol around the corner and I put the torch around. When I switched it on, there was a dog sitting there, buddy, growling at me. So I promptly got a bit frustrated and put 9 rounds into it.
We actually searched these tunnel systems for 5 days, and at the end of that time, they were going in both directions, still completing. We searched out 3/4 of a mile.
What else could you do? Because you didn't know what was going on.
who was there. You just snuck along nice and careful and kept your pistol ready.
We were part of a major force of 173rd Airborne Brigade, so we were only one battalion group, and as such, we were told that we were needed to withdraw because the whole of the brigade is withdrawing. Wow, were we disappointed to withdraw.
I wasn't disappointed, I can tell you that right now.
But they tell me there was 5,000 fully armed troops down there. Thank Christ they kept moving.
The 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment marched through the streets of Sydney on the 8th of June 1966 to a tumultuous Walpam.
There was a lady covered herself in red paint and ran into the CO, and I think that was a real eye-opener to a lot of fellows, that there was that depth of opposition.
Can you see any limit to the extent of our military commitment to South Vietnam?
I don't believe that our military commitment to South Vietnam can, in the present situation, go much beyond the present commitment.
Over the next year, the Army worked towards assembling a task force. At the same time, the Americans were asking us for more troops, and Harold Holt finally gave his agreement that a task force be sent.
And it wasn't until the government made the announcement that the battalion got all the priority it needed to be filled up with troops and get all the priority and training. And in fact, we had about 90 days from that announcement until we were ready to go.
1966, we were the first ones into Nui Dap. The impressions when I arrived, nice scenery, nice rubber plantation, where are we going to live? And they virtually said, well, when you get something built, that's where you're going to live.
The food was terrible. The accommodation was basically hutchies and eventually 16 to 16 tents. But because it was the monsoon season, the mud was everywhere. And the weapon pits were full of water.
Well, patrolling is the bread and butter of the infantryman. Unfortunately, it's more stale bread than butter, and it's very boring and very repetitive, and it's something that's just done day after day after day.
Carrying something like 100 pounds of equipment that seems determined to cut through your shoulders. You're hungry all the time, you're thirsty all the time, tired all the time, of course. And when combat comes, you have to face the ridiculous task of trying to run through jungle carrying 100 pounds or more of equipment, knowing full well that the people you're fighting are carrying half a dozen rounds of ammunition in their pocket and couldn't quite easily outrun you.
The enemy worked on the principle that it was essential for him to have the support of the people. He could obtain food, medical supplies, he could obtain labour when he wanted it, and recruits for his army. He could also, most importantly, merge with the people so that we, the foreigners, could not determine friend from foe.
It's just continuous patrolling. We spent half a year in the jungle, and the only time you seen them bastards was when they let go a burst of AK-47 down the centre of you, buzzing past your ears.
When you're in contact with somebody, it becomes very personalised. If someone's trying to kill you or you're trying to kill them, you can feel as if you may be going to the happy hunting ground at any time.
You know, you were there 5 minutes ago, and now you're not. And in half an hour, I'm wrapping you up in a poncho and sending you home. That is bad news.
There was a bang, and I went up and through the air, and I can remember dust and the ringing in my ears, and everybody screaming for medics and dust off helicopters, and I just left lying there looking into the sun.
You were halting the deterioration of the soldiers' medical condition, surgical condition, as much as possible so that they were alive until they got to the hospital. You stopped bleeding, you filled in sucking chest wounds so that didn't kill them on the trip.
The role for the dust-off for our aircraft was no more difficult than the standard mission that you happen to be flying at the time. You'd pick up the patient, take him to the nearest hospital or the head hospital if necessary. That was a big morale booster for the troop on the ground, because he knew darn well if he got hurt, he had a fair chance of being pulled out very quickly, and he could be in a hospital within 10 or 15 minutes.
The dust-off system was a very efficient system. We would have warning wherever we were around the hospital as the choppers were coming in.
Well, I actually thought I'd woken up in a storeroom, but I
I realise now it was night time, and they used to use Christmas tree lights for night lighting, and that's what made me think I was in a storeroom, because I thought I'd been put out the back with the leftover Christmas decorations. I knew back out on the minefield that I'd lost my leg, that I just felt that my leg had been blown off, and I can remember saying to the nurse, "Have I lost my leg?" And she went into a little bit of a panic and said, "I'll get the doctor to talk to you."